The Russian Tsar Nicholas II said in 1905, "I shall never, under any circumstances, agree to a representative form of government, because I consider it harmful to the people whom God has entrusted to my care." The primary question here is, how did internal and external factors contribute to change in various states after 1900? An intense period of rebellion continued into the early 1900s. Nicholas II, the last Russian Tsar, clearly did not understand the force of political opposition to his rule that resulted in his assassination in 1918. In the 20th century's first 2 decades, rebellions erupted against long-standing authoritarian governments in Russia, China, and Mexico. Revolutionaries unseated ruling governments in each country, challenging the existing political and social order and instituting their own political philosophies and practices. Established land-based and maritime empires collapsed under pressure from internal and external forces. By the end of the century, a new global order had emerged. By the early 20th century, Russia was falling behind most of Europe, the United States, and Japan in wealth and in power. Russia's most obvious challenges were internal. While governments in other industrializing states in the 19th century were actively promoting economic growth, Russia was not. It was slow to expand education for peasants, build roads and other parts of its transportation networks, and support business people with loans and contracts. Further, the Tsarist government resisted calls for political reform. It was reluctant to recognize civil liberties and to allow citizens to participate in government. These internal problems led to external ones. Without a strong economic base to support a military, Russia then became weaker in international affairs. It lost the Crimean War from 1853 to 1856 against the Ottoman Empire, which was supported by Great Britain and France. It lost the Russo-Japanese War in 1905 in a battle for power in East Asia. In the fall of 1917, the Bolsheviks, an organization representing the revolutionary working class of Russia under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, seized power and set up a communist government with Lenin at its head. The communists believed that workers should eventually own the means of production and that collective ownership would lead to collective prosperity and a just society. Toward the long-term goal, the Soviet government abolished private trade, gave peasants land and crops to feed the urban workers, and took over ownership of the country's factories and heavy industries. The success of the Bolsheviks in taking power shook the world. They were the first example of communists running a large country. Throughout the capitalist world, from Europe to the United States to Japan, people worried that communists were in danger to their governments as well. The conflict between communism and capitalism would become an important issue, shaping world affairs in the rest of the 20th century. Here are the key events leading to the Russian Revolution. The first attempt at revolution happened in 1905. At that time, the soldiers still listened to the troops and they opened fire, and that revolution was over. Those strikes continued on at different times, but for the most part, the army was still loyal to the Tsar. Yet the army was demoralized and lacked effective weaponry and training. They lost the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. They went on to suffer devastating losses in World War I as the Tsar tried to run this war personally. This is going to lead to his assassination and death, and Russia was just not ready for this new type of warfare. China was another land-based empire that collapsed in this period from problems it faced at home and from other countries. The Qing dynasty had come to power in China in 1644, Finally, a revolution overthrew it in 1911, creating a republic led first by Dr. Sun Yat-sen. However, his rule was short. China faced daunting domestic concerns in the 19th century, each of which weakened support for the government. One of these was ethnic tension. China consisted of dozens of ethnic groups. The largest group was the Han Chinese. The rulers of the Qing dynasty were Manchus from a region northeast of China. Many Han Chinese never fully accepted the Qing as legitimate rulers of China. By the late 19th century, the Qing had ruled China for over 2 centuries, but they had remained ethnically distinct. A second problem was the constant danger of famine. China experienced rapid population growth between the mid-1700s and mid-1800s, but could not expand the amount of farmland or productivity rapidly enough to provide a stable food supply. Any natural disaster, such as a drought or a flood, could result in the early deaths of thousands of people. Third, the government revenues were very low. The imperial government had not updated the tax system to adjust to changes in the economy. As a result, compared to Europe or the United States, taxes in China were low. This meant that the government did not have the resources to maintain roads, bridges, and irrigation canals. China had been one of the wealthiest, most powerful, most innovative states in the world for much of its recorded history. However, starting in the late 18th century, it faced growing threats to its position by industrialization in Europe. In the late 18th century, Europeans interested in the Chinese market could trade only in the city of Canton. Europeans commonly bought tea, rhubarb, porcelain, and silk. In Europe, Chinese fashions, table settings, and art objects were very popular. The Chinese received European silver in exchange for what they sold. However, the Chinese did not desire the products Europeans produced, and they looked down on Europeans as violent and less civilized. In response to growing European influence in China, many Chinese did rally behind the empress in the 1890s. However, the desire to support the empress against foreign pressure was not enough to save the Qing dynasty. In 1911, the last Chinese dynasty was overthrown by a revolutionary movement led by Sun Yat-sen. Though a Christian, Sun believed that China should continue to follow such Confucian principles such as loyalty, respect for ancestors, and efforts to promote social harmony. He combined these traditions with the ideas he later elaborated upon in his book, The Three People's Principles. Democracy was the first principle. Sun believed in sovereignty, not for all people, but for those Chinese who were able. In Confucian terms, this meant a country governed by active, pragmatic experts in the name of the people. He felt that expelling foreign capitalists from China would enable China to redistribute revenues from land taxes more fairly, since the revenues would not have to be used to pay debts to foreigners. His next idea was nationalism. Sun advocated patriotism and loyalty, primarily to central authority. His third idea was livelihood. Sun wanted to end the extreme, unequal distribution of wealth in China and the harsh economic exploitation. Sun Yat-sen never had enough military strength to rule all of China. Various warlords controlled the majority of the country. Sun recognized the weakness of his position. After 2 months in office, he gave up his position to a military leader. The party Sun led, the Chinese Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang, would later regain power. It would rule China for 2 decades before losing a civil war with the Chinese Communists. While both the Kuomintang and the Communists would honor Sun as the founder of the Chinese Republic, neither would fully implement his principles. By the beginning of the 20th century, the once mighty Ottoman Empire was now the sick man of Europe, had relatively few exports and a waning agricultural economy. The empire relied mostly upon its position as a trade center. Egypt, by contrast, continued to make profits from cotton. As Ottoman prosperity declined, a group of reformers known as the Young Turks emerged. They advocated for a constitution like those of the European states. They also advocated Turkification, an effort to make all citizens of the multi-ethnic empire identify with Turkish culture, which was heavily Islamic. For the millions of Armenians in the empire who were mostly Christians, this was difficult. In response, some Young Turks scapegoated or unfairly blamed Armenians for the empire's economic problems. Turks resented many Europeans, particularly the British and the French, for their economic policies. Foreign investments had given Europeans undue power in the empire. Further, Europeans had imposed trade privileges that were unprofitable for the Ottomans. Because of these resentments, the Ottoman Empire secretly allied with Germany in World War I. After Germany's defeat in World War I, the Ottoman Empire was dismantled by the victorious powers. It was replaced by a smaller nation-state, the Republic of Turkey, and several independent countries. Victorious Allied forces immediately sent troops to occupy Turkey. Although the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire remained on his throne, he had little power. He served as a mere puppet for the British forces that hoped to control the lands of the former empire. During the war, a group called the Turkish National Movement organized an army to fight for self-determination. Led by Mustafa Kemal, the Turkish nationalists defeated the British and other forces in 1921. The Republic of Turkey was established in 1923, with Kemal as the first president. The new National Assembly awarded him the surname Ataturk, or Father of the Turk, in recognition of his role in establishing the new republic. Ataturk's policies focused on reforming Turkey to make it more like Western democracies. He was determined to create a secular nation, not one with strong Islamic influences. He implemented several reforms, establishing public education for boys and girls, abolishing polygamy, and expanding suffrage to include women. As a symbolic gesture, he wore mainly Western suits and hats, and encouraged others to do the same. Despite his reforms, he ruled as a dictator for 15 years. He did not give up power before his death in 1938. Mexico entered the 20th century as an independent nation firmly under the control of a dictator, Porfirio Diaz. He oversaw a period of stability and some economic progress. However, he had allowed foreign investors, particularly those from the United States, control over many of the country's resources. Additionally, the wealthiest 1% of the population controlled 97% of the land. Typical Mexican peasants were landless. In 1910, Diaz jailed Francisco Madero, the opposition candidate for president. This act, combined with growing opposition to Diaz's strong-armed policies, accommodation to foreign powers, and opposition to land reform, ignited the Mexican Revolution. Madero escaped and set up revolutionary offices in El Paso, Texas. Then, in 1911, Madero's troops, under the command of Francisco Pancho Villa, defeated Mexican troops, sending Diaz into exile. One revolutionary leader, Emiliano Zapata, began the actual process of giving land to impoverished peasants. Until 1920, Mexico suffered from political instability and devastating violence. Between 1910 and 1920, the conflict resulted in around 2 million deaths out of a population of around 15 million people. Political violence continued for another decade. However, two results came out of the conflicts between 1910 and 1930 that provided Mexico with stability for the rest of the century. First, Mexico adopted a new constitution in 1917. It included the goals of land redistribution, universal suffrage, and public education. These principles continued to guide Mexico's government. Also, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI, was formed in 1929. Though widely criticized as corrupt, the PRI dominated Mexican politics. Until 2000, all presidents were PRI members.